Your Majesty, you are not dying. Grace Bennet kept 2 fingers against the Alpha King's wrist and counted his pulse for the 3rd time. Steady, strong, completely normal. King Alexander Whitmore lay against a mountain of pillows in his private chamber with the solemn expression of a man preparing to hear terrible news. At 40 years old, he had ruled the Northern Territories for nearly a decade, negotiated border disputes without raising his voice, and faced entire councils without blinking. Yet tonight, according to him, standing up from dinner had left him mysteriously weak. Grace narrowed her eyes. Your pulse is normal. Your breathing is normal. You do not have a fever. Alexander looked thoughtful. Perhaps it is a rare condition. Perhaps. Grace released his wrist and reached for the leather medical bag beside her chair. Or perhaps you were tired because you attended meetings for 11 hours and forgot lunch. I had lunch. Coffee is not lunch. There was cream in it. Grace stared at him. Alexander's mouth moved slightly, almost betraying a smile. She caught it. You find this entertaining. Being gravely ill? You are not gravely ill. You sound very confident. I am a healer. Confidence is generally useful. Grace had served in the Royal Infirmary for 2 years, but she rarely treated Alexander personally. The Alpha King almost never became sick. He worked too much, slept too little, and regarded rest as a scheduling error, but his health was famously irritating. That was why receiving an urgent summons to his private rooms had frightened her. It was also why his current condition made absolutely no sense. She stood. Drink water. Eat something. Sleep 8 hours. If anything changes, send for the royal physician. Alexander shifted against the pillows. You are leaving? Grace paused. His voice had sounded noticeably healthier. Yes. Already. I have examined you for 40 minutes. That does seem brief for a royal medical crisis. She slowly turned. What crisis? Alexander considered that. The weakness. Where exactly do you feel weak? His gray eyes met hers. For the first time that evening, the mighty Alpha King looked almost uncertain. Mostly when you leave the room. Grace blinked. Silence settled between them. Then she laughed, because there was no reasonable alternative. That is not a medical symptom. Are you certain? Very. She began closing her bag. I can find you a second opinion tomorrow. I prefer yours. The answer came too quickly. Grace looked back at him. Alexander had already rearranged his expression into something appropriately royal and serious. She was beginning to suspect that the most powerful alpha in the kingdom was also an exceptionally difficult patient. A quiet knock sounded at the door. Daniel Brooks, the king's longtime aide, stepped inside carrying a stack of documents. His gaze moved from Grace to Alexander, then to the untouched dinner tray. Feeling better, Your Majesty? Alexander answered before Grace could. Marginally. Daniel frowned. Interesting. You seemed perfectly fine during the council meeting 20 minutes before Miss Bennet arrived. Alexander became very still. Grace slowly turned toward him. Daniel noticed the silence and immediately understood that he had entered dangerous conversational territory. I should probably leave. You should, Alexander said. Daniel disappeared behind the door. Grace folded her arms. Perfectly fine. Daniel exaggerates. He said 6 words. He can be remarkably efficient. Grace tried not to smile. I'm going back to the infirmary. Alexander sighed and settled deeper into the pillows. Then I suppose the weakness may return. She stopped at the door. Your Majesty. Yes. Grace looked over her shoulder. Alexander was watching her with an expression far too innocent for a man who commanded half the continent. If you suddenly become unable to survive without your healer standing 5 feet away, I am prescribing the worst herbal tonic in my cabinet. Alexander's face finally betrayed him. He smiled. Perhaps I am recovering already. Grace walked into the corridor shaking her head, but the smile followed her all the way back to the infirmary. Behind the closed door, Daniel returned 30 seconds later and found the Alpha King sitting upright, perfectly healthy. So, Daniel said, how long are you planning to pretend you are sick? Alexander looked toward the door Grace had just closed. I have not decided. By 8 the next morning, Grace had already received 3 separate messages from the king's chambers. The first claimed fatigue. The second mentioned a mild headache. The third simply said His Majesty felt unusually weak and preferred that Healer Bennet examine him personally. Grace stood in the royal infirmary reading the final note twice. Unusually weak, she murmured. Her assistant looked up from organizing bandages. Is something wrong? That depends on whether stubbornness has recently become contagious. 15 minutes later, Grace entered Alexander's private sitting room, carrying her medical bag and the darkest herbal tonic she owned. The Alpha King was seated beside the fireplace reviewing government papers. He looked alert, freshly dressed, and completely healthy. The moment he noticed her, however, his shoulders lowered slightly. Grace. She stopped. That was impressive. Alexander frowned. What was the illness? It appeared the second I entered. A suspicious hint of amusement touched his eyes. Perhaps seeing my healer reminded my body that it is unwell. Bodies do not work that way. Mine may be unusually loyal to protocol. Grace placed the bottle of tonic on the table. Alexander stared at it. What is that? Your treatment. His confidence weakened for the first time. It looks unpleasant. It tastes worse. Daniel, standing near the window with a stack of correspondence, suddenly became fascinated by the gardens outside. Grace poured a small amount into a cup. Drink. Alexander looked from the cup to her. Is that medically necessary? Completely. You answered very quickly. I am confident. Daniel covered a cough that sounded suspiciously like laughter. Alexander accepted the cup with royal dignity and took one careful sip. His expression remained controlled for almost 2 seconds. That is terrible. Excellent. Your sense of taste is functioning perfectly. Grace reached for his wrist. His pulse was steady again. She checked his temperature, listened to his breathing, and asked him to describe the headache. It began this morning, he said. Where? Alexander touched one temple. Here. Sharp or dull? He hesitated. Dull. Constant. Mostly. Does light make it worse? Another pause. Sometimes. Grace looked at him. Alexander looked back. Your Majesty, have you ever actually had a headache? Daniel turned toward the window completely. Of course I have. When? Recently. How recently? Alexander considered the fireplace. I dislike interrogations before breakfast. You already ate breakfast. His eyes narrowed. How do you know? Grace pointed toward the empty plate beside him. I am a healer, not a magician. She released his wrist and began packing her instruments. Alexander immediately leaned back in his chair. There is also the fatigue. Grace stopped. Naturally. It seems worse now. Interesting timing. Illness can be unpredictable. So can my schedule. She lifted her bag. I have 14 patients waiting downstairs. The playful expression disappeared from Alexander's face. 14. Yes. Something like guilt crossed his features, but only briefly. Then you should go. Grace paused. That answer surprised her. I thought your mysterious weakness was worsening. Apparently, I am recovering. Daniel glanced at him, equally surprised. Grace studied Alexander for another moment, then nodded. Drink water. Eat lunch before noon. No council meetings after 10 tonight. That sounds severe. You will survive. She turned toward the door. Grace. She looked back. Alexander was no longer smiling. Thank you for coming. The sincerity in his voice softened her suspicion despite herself. That is my job. I know. She left before the strange warmth in her chest could become inconvenient. When the door closed, Daniel waited several seconds. You forgot to look sick. Alexander returned to his papers. She had 14 patients. So, Alexander looked toward the door. So, I am beginning to suspect this plan may have flaws. Daniel smiled. Only beginning. Grace told herself she was only being thorough. That was why, by the following afternoon, she had created a separate page in the king's medical file titled Recurring Symptoms. It had nothing to do with curiosity. Nothing at all. She sat at her desk in the royal infirmary, reviewing the notes. Headache appeared shortly before she arrived. Fatigue intensified whenever she mentioned leaving. Weakness disappeared during discussions about council business. Appetite excellent, despite claims of feeling unwell. Grace tapped the end of her pencil against the page. Either His Majesty has discovered a completely new illness, she murmured, or he is the worst liar in the Northern Territories. Her assistant glanced over. Should I ask which possibility concerns you more? No, a messenger arrived before Grace could add anything else. King Alexander requested another examination. Of course he did. 20 minutes later, she entered his private study and found him standing beside a large map table, speaking with Daniel about trade routes. Alexander's posture was straight. His voice was strong. He looked like a man capable of running the kingdom for another 12 hours without blinking. Then he saw Grace. "Daniel," he said, suddenly lowering himself into a chair. "Perhaps we should continue later." Grace stopped in the doorway. Daniel looked at Alexander, then at Grace, then slowly toward the ceiling. "Remarkable," Grace said. Alexander remained perfectly composed. "What is the speed of your decline?" Daniel coughed into his fist. Grace walked closer and opened her medical bag. "What is wrong today?" "Difficulty sleeping. You were asleep when I checked on you at midnight 2 nights ago." Alexander blinked. Briefly. "How many hours did you sleep last night?" 4. "Because you were ill?" He hesitated. "Because I had reports to read." Grace wrote something down. "That is not insomnia. That is poor judgment." Daniel turned his face away to hide a smile. Alexander glanced at the page. "What are you writing?" "Medical observations." "May I see them?" "No, I am the king, and I am holding the medical file." Alexander seemed genuinely impressed by that answer. Grace checked his pulse. "Normal." "Again. Any dizziness?" "Occasionally." "When?" "Earlier." "Before or after lunch?" A pause. "Before." "What did you eat?" "Roast chicken." "Potatoes." "Bread." Grace looked at him. "That is an ambitious meal for a dizzy man." "My appetite remains resilient." She nearly smiled. "Nearly. Does standing make the dizziness worse?" "Sometimes." "Bright light?" "Possibly." "Cold air?" Alexander hesitated. "Potentially." Grace narrowed her eyes. "Does hearing difficult medical questions make it worse?" Daniel made a choking sound near the window. Alexander gave him a warning look. Grace folded her arms. "Your symptoms have no pattern. Some illnesses are mysterious. Not this mysterious." She stepped closer. "Yesterday, your headache vanished when I stopped asking about it. Your weakness vanished when Daniel mentioned council documents. Today, you were standing perfectly well until I entered." Alexander looked thoughtful. "Perhaps your presence has an unusual effect on me." Grace's pencil stopped. There was humor in his voice, but something warmer beneath it. She ignored the sudden flutter in her chest. "That is not how medicine works." "You keep saying that." "Because you keep inventing new ways to challenge basic medical science." His mouth curved. Grace closed the file. "I am changing your treatment." Alexander immediately looked cautious. "To what?" "Observation." "Meaning?" "For the next 2 days, you will record exactly when each symptom begins, what you are doing, what you ate, how much you slept, and who was in the room." Alexander's expression became far less confident. "That seems excessive. You wanted a thorough healer." Daniel suddenly found the wall extremely interesting. Grace handed Alexander the blank symptom sheet. "And I will compare your answers personally." Alexander took it slowly. "Personally?" "Yes." For some reason, his concern disappeared. "Then I accept." Grace stared at him. That was not the reaction she expected. "You realize this means more questions." "I understand. And possibly more tonic." His smile weakened. "That feels unnecessary." Grace finally smiled. "We will see." She turned toward the door, then stopped. "One more thing. If your symptoms suddenly worsen whenever I leave, write that down too." Alexander became very still. Daniel lowered his head. Grace walked out before either man could answer. The moment the door closed, Daniel looked at the king. "She knows." Alexander studied the symptom sheet in his hand. "She suspects." That is a very optimistic distinction. Alexander glanced toward the door Grace had just left through. "Then I should probably become a more convincing patient." Alexander's attempt to become a more convincing patient lasted less than a day. By evening, Grace found him in the royal library standing on a ladder, reaching for a ledger from the highest shelf. She stopped in the doorway and stared. "Remarkable recovery." Alexander froze with one hand around the book. Slowly, he looked down at her. "I was searching for something. Apparently your mysterious dizziness improves at 8 feet above the floor." Daniel, seated at a nearby desk, lowered his head over a document. His shoulders moved once. Grace pointed toward the ground. "Down." Alexander raised an eyebrow. Was that a medical instruction or a royal command? "Whichever one gets you off the ladder." He descended with surprising obedience. Grace opened the symptom sheet he had been carrying all day. Almost every line was blank. "You were supposed to record your symptoms." I became distracted. "By governing?" "Unfortunately." "Your headache?" "Gone." "Weakness?" "Improved." "Difficulty sleeping?" Alexander glanced toward Daniel. "Undetermined." Grace closed the paper. You are either recovering at record speed or you were never seriously ill. For once, he did not offer a clever answer. The silence between them felt different. Softer. Grace noticed how tired he actually looked beneath the jokes. Not sick. Tired. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes, and several unopened reports waited on the table. When did you last take an evening off? She asked. Alexander seemed confused by the question. I am taking one now. Grace looked at the documents surrounding him. This is a library full of government work. It is quieter than the council chamber. That does not make it rest. Daniel finally spoke. I have been explaining this for 6 years. Alexander gave him a flat look. Your support is unnecessary. I am supporting the healer. Grace almost smiled. She moved toward the fireplace and noticed a tray of untouched tea growing cold. Sit. Alexander looked suspicious. Again, this time because you are exhausted, not because I believe your imaginary illness. He sat in the chair opposite her. Grace poured fresh tea from the small warming pot and handed him a cup. Drink. Is there tonic in this? Not unless you complain. He took a careful sip. For several minutes, the room became quiet. No examination. No pulse counting. No ridiculous symptoms. Just rain tapping softly against the tall windows and firelight warming the old shelves. Grace leaned back in her chair. Why do you work this late? Alexander studied the tea. Because people need answers. Tonight. Always. His voice had lost its playful edge. Every room I enter has someone waiting for a decision. Trade. Land. Council appointments. Pact disputes. Even dinner becomes a discussion about something the kingdom needs. Grace watched him more carefully. This was the first time she had seen Alexander without the crown, even while he was technically still wearing it. And when I enter? She asked. A small smile touched his face. You usually ask where it hurts. Grace felt something unexpectedly warm settle in her chest. That is because I am a healer. I know. He looked at her. It is also why I like when you are here. The honesty caught her completely unprepared. Grace glanced toward the fire. That almost sounded like a confession. Perhaps the fever has returned. She looked back at him. You never had a fever. Then I am running out of explanations. This time she laughed, and Alexander smiled with her. Daniel quietly gathered his papers. I believe the kingdom can survive without me for the next 10 minutes. Alexander looked toward him. Where are you going? Somewhere far enough away that I cannot accidentally ruin another mysterious medical development. He left before either of them could stop him. Grace shook her head. He is enjoying this. Far too much. She rose and moved toward the window, opening it an inch to let cool evening air into the room. Alexander watched her. You always do that. Do what? Adjust the room before I ask. Grace shrugged. You concentrate better when it is cooler. You noticed. I noticed my patience. The words came naturally, but something in his expression changed. Grace felt it too. She picked up her medical bag before the silence became too personal. Get some sleep tonight. Real sleep. Alexander nodded. Will you check on me tomorrow? Grace paused at the doorway. His voice was light, but his eyes were not. If you are actually sick. Alexander leaned back in his chair. That seems like an unnecessarily strict condition. She smiled. Good night, Your Majesty. Good night, Grace. She left the library still smiling, unaware that behind her, Alexander sat staring at the closed door with absolutely no interest in pretending to be sick for the next few minutes. Grace should have been asleep. Instead, nearly 2 hours after midnight, she sat alone beneath the amber lamps of the Royal Infirmary with 3 medical volumes open around her and Alexander's symptom notes spread across the desk. Nothing matched. Not the headaches. Not the dizziness. Not the strange fatigue that appeared and vanished without explanation. She had been teasing him for days, convinced that half his complaints were exaggerated, but a quieter possibility had begun bothering her. What if she was wrong? What if something unusual was actually happening and she had dismissed it because the Alpha King happened to be an impossible patient? Grace rubbed her tired eyes and turned another page. Rare metabolic conditions. Stress disorders. Magical exhaustion. Nothing fit. She checked the clock and sighed. Her scheduled morning off was now less than 6 hours away. She reached for another book anyway. Across the castle, Alexander was finishing a late council session when Daniel placed a folder beside him. One final problem. Alexander leaned back. That sentence has never improved an evening. Healer Bennett canceled her morning leave. Alexander looked up immediately. Why? Daniel hesitated. Apparently, she requested access to the restricted medical archive. The humor left Alexander's face. For what? Daniel gave him a long look. You. Alexander became still. She thinks something is actually wrong. You have spent 3 days telling her something is actually wrong. The truth landed harder than Daniel intended. Alexander stood. Where is she? 10 minutes later, he found Grace asleep at her desk, her cheek resting against one folded arm. The sight stopped him at the infirmary doorway. Medical books surrounded her. His medical file lay open beside a handwritten list of possible conditions. At the top, Grace had written one sentence. Symptoms remain inconsistent. Rule out rare causes before assuming exaggeration. Alexander stared at it. The joke suddenly felt much less funny. Grace stirred and lifted her head. Your Majesty? She blinked toward the clock. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing. She straightened quickly. I was researching. At 2 in the morning. Some conditions are difficult to identify. Alexander looked at the books. You canceled your morning off. Grace frowned. How do you know that? Daniel. Daniel talks too much. For once, I am grateful. He pulled out the chair across from her, but did not sit. Grace, you should go home. She looked genuinely confused. You are my patient. The simple words made guilt tighten inside him. And you have other patients. I know. 14 yesterday. She studied his face. You remembered. Alexander ignored that. You should not be losing sleep over me. Grace softened slightly. That is part of being responsible for someone's care. Not when that person is making your work harder than necessary. Her eyes narrowed. Alexander immediately realized he had come dangerously close to saying too much. What does that mean? It means I have been difficult. Grace gave him a tired smile. That is hardly new information. Normally, he would have answered with a joke. Tonight he could not. She opened another book. I keep thinking I missed something. Your symptoms make no sense, but that does not mean they are imaginary. Alexander looked down at the page, then back at her exhausted face. He had wanted her attention. He had wanted another hour of conversation, another cup of tea, another excuse to hear her laugh at him. He had never wanted her worried. Grace. Something in his tone made her stop. What? He nearly told her everything. Then fear, ridiculous and unfamiliar, closed around the confession. If he admitted the truth, she might never trust him again. I feel better, he said instead. Grace watched him carefully. Completely. Almost. Since when? Alexander glanced toward the books. Since realizing my healer is more stubborn than I am. She smiled despite herself. That is not medically possible. Neither is half my condition, apparently. Grace closed the book. Go sleep, Your Majesty. Only if you do. Are you giving me an order? A request. That made her pause. Finally, she gathered her notes. Fine. For hours. 8. 6. 7. Grace looked at him. You negotiate medical rest? I negotiate everything. She laughed softly, and the sound should have relieved him. It did not. As Grace walked toward the infirmary door, Alexander looked at the medical books she had opened because of him. For the first time since his foolish plan began, he was no longer wondering how to keep his healer close. He was wondering how to tell her the truth without losing her. By late morning, Grace had slept exactly 6 hours and regretted agreeing to anything less than 7. She returned to the royal wing carrying fresh notes, a cup of coffee, and a determination to stop guessing. Alexander was already in his study, standing beside the window with a report in one hand and looking healthier than any man who had inspired midnight research had a right to look. Good morning, he said. Grace set her medical bag on the table. You look terrible. Alexander glanced down at himself. That is surprising. I feel excellent. She froze. He froze too. Daniel, seated near the fireplace, slowly lowered the document he was reading. Grace turned toward Alexander. Excellent. Relatively. Compared with what? Yesterday. Yesterday you claimed fatigue, dizziness, headaches, and difficulty sleeping. Alexander cleared his throat. Recovery can be swift. Grace stared at him. Apparently miraculous. Daniel covered his mouth with one hand. Alexander gave him a warning look. Grace crossed the room and held out her hand. Pulse. Alexander obediently offered his wrist. Strong. Steady. Normal. Again. Any dizziness this morning? None. Headache? Gone. Weakness? Improved. Difficulty concentrating? Only during long council meetings. That is not a symptom. I have argued otherwise for years. Grace released his wrist. Did you sleep? 7 hours. She blinked. You actually listened to me? Do not sound so shocked. I am documenting the occasion. Daniel made the mistake of speaking. He was perfectly healthy before breakfast too. Silence filled the study. Alexander closed his eyes. Grace slowly looked toward Daniel. Perfectly healthy? Daniel realized what he had done. I meant healthier. That is not what you said. Language is complicated. Alexander opened his eyes and looked at his aide with deep disappointment. Daniel. Yes, Your Majesty. You may leave. Daniel stood immediately. Gladly. Grace stepped between him and the door. No. Stay. Daniel stopped. Alexander looked almost offended. You cannot countermand the king in his own study. I am not countermanding anyone. I am asking a witness to remain. Daniel sat back down with the expression of a man who had accidentally purchased front-row seats to his own disaster. Grace folded her arms. When exactly was His Majesty perfectly healthy? Daniel looked at Alexander. Alexander looked back. Neither spoke. Interesting, Grace said. Suddenly, everyone has developed the same condition. Which condition? Alexander asked carefully. Selective silence. Daniel stared very hard at the floor. Grace moved closer to Alexander. I want an honest answer. Have you been exaggerating your symptoms? His humor disappeared. For 1 second, she thought he might finally confess. Then he said, some of them. Her stomach tightened. Some. The fatigue was real. Because you work too much. That is possible. The headache? Less severe than described. The dizziness? Alexander hesitated. Grace stared at him. Was there any dizziness? Not in the traditional sense. Daniel made a quiet sound of despair. Grace placed both hands on her hips. What does that mean? Alexander rubbed one hand over his jaw. It means I may have made a poor decision. 1. Daniel muttered. Alexander ignored him. Grace felt irritation rise, but beneath it came something worse. Relief. He was not sick. The terrifying possibility she had spent hours researching was disappearing. She should have been angry first. Instead, she wanted to sit down. Alexander saw the change in her face. Grace. I thought I missed something. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. I stayed awake because I thought there might be something wrong that I was not skilled enough to find. The guilt on Alexander's face deepened. I know. No, I do not think you did. He stepped closer but stopped several feet away. You are right. No joke. No royal defense. Just the words. Grace looked at him, suddenly exhausted all over again. Daniel quietly stood. I believe this conversation no longer requires a witness. This time neither stopped him. When the door closed, Alexander faced Grace alone. I owe you the truth. She held his gaze. Yes, you do. He took a slow breath. I was not trying to make you afraid. Then what were you trying to do? For the first time since Grace had met him, the Alpha King looked genuinely uncertain. He glanced toward the chair where she usually sat during examinations, then back at her. At first, his mouth tightened with embarrassment. I wanted an excuse to keep you in the room a little longer. Grace stared at him, and suddenly every impossible symptom began making perfect sense. Grace stared at him so long that Alexander finally looked away. The Alpha King, who could face a room full of council leaders without hesitation, now seemed deeply interested in the pattern of the rug beneath his boots. You wanted me to stay? She asked. Yes. So you invented dizziness. That sounds worse when you say it. It should. His mouth twitched, but he did not smile fully. Grace folded her arms. And the headaches? Mostly fictional. The weakness? Poorly researched. The insomnia? Alexander paused. That one was partially real. Because you work until midnight. You remained frustratingly observant. She should have been angry. Part of her was. Another part was trying very hard not to laugh at the absurdity of the most powerful man in the Northern Territories pretending to be medically fragile because he did not know how to ask an Omega to spend time with him. Why did you not just say you wanted company? Grace asked. Alexander gave her a look that was almost offended. I am the Alpha King. That is not an explanation. It explains more than you think. He moved toward the window, then stopped. People say yes to me before I finish asking. They agree because of the title. The guards agree. The council agrees. Half the court agrees while privately hating the idea. Grace watched him. And you thought pretending to be sick solved that? At the time, it seemed less complicated. You are very bad at being dishonest. I have discovered that. She finally let herself smile. Alexander noticed immediately. Is that a good sign? Do not become optimistic. Too late. Grace shook her head and reached for her medical bag. Then I suppose your treatment is complete. His expression changed. Complete. You are healthy. Very healthy? Annoyingly healthy. So I no longer require observation. Correct. He looked genuinely disappointed. Grace tried not to enjoy that. She closed the bag slowly. Unless, of course, there was some particular treatment you were hoping I might recommend. Alexander went completely still. Grace kept her expression professional, though her heartbeat had begun to betray her. Treatment, he repeated. Yes. You have been remarkably committed to this illness. I assume you had an end goal. His gray eyes narrowed slightly. He had finally realized she was testing him. You are enjoying this. I am conducting a medical interview. That is a dangerous smile for a medical interview. Answer the question. Alexander exhaled. I may have hoped for more time with you. That has been established. Perhaps conversation. You could have asked. Clearly. Possibly. Grace stepped closer. Anything else? For once, the Alpha King seemed uncertain where to put his hands. I am beginning to dislike this examination. Interesting. Your pulse appears faster. Alexander looked at her. That may actually be your fault. Grace nearly laughed. Still not a diagnosis. He studied her face, and the playful tension between them softened. There was one thought, he admitted. A foolish one. I have already heard about imaginary dizziness. My standards are flexible. His voice dropped. I wondered whether affection had medicinal value. Grace held his gaze. Affection? Possibly. That is very vague. I am trying to preserve what remains of my dignity. She took one more step toward him, stopping at a respectful distance. Alexander's confidence disappeared almost completely. Grace had never seen anything quite so entertaining. Were you planning to fake an illness? She asked softly. Until I kissed you? Silence. Alexander blinked once. Then again. The mighty Alpha King, commander of councils and ruler of territories, had no answer. Grace raised one eyebrow. Your Majesty? He cleared his throat. When stated that directly, the strategy does sound questionable. Questionable. Extremely. Grace pressed her lips together to keep from laughing. So that was the plan. It was less of a plan and more of an increasingly poor series of decisions. That is the first medically accurate thing you have said all week. Alexander finally smiled, but it faded quickly. Grace, I never intended to pressure you. Her expression softened. I know, and I would never take something you did not freely choose to give. That mattered, more than the ridiculous lie. Grace nodded once. Good. Alexander looked relieved. So you are not furious? I have not decided. Should I become ill again? She pointed toward the door. Do not test your recovery. He laughed, then stopped when Grace reached for the handle. Grace. She looked back. Yes. His expression was open now. No performance. No false weakness. What happens next? Grace considered him for a moment. Next, you learn something very important. What? Her smile returned. If you want a kiss from your healer, you ask. Then she left him standing in the study, perfectly healthy and completely speechless. Grace did not return to the royal study that afternoon. Alexander noticed. He noticed at dinner too, when the seat she sometimes used near the infirmary table remained empty. By evening, even Daniel noticed that the king had asked 3 separate times whether anyone from the medical staff had sent a message. She said you were healthy, Daniel reminded him. Alexander looked down at the report in front of him without reading a single line. I remember. Then perhaps this is the part where you behave like a healthy man. Alexander gave him a flat look. That is remarkably unhelpful. You hired me for honesty. I hired you for efficiency. Today you are receiving both. Alexander leaned back in his chair and exhaled. For the first time all week, there was no false symptom to hide behind. No excuse to summon Grace. No invented headache. Just the uncomfortable truth that she had walked away after telling him exactly what he should have done from the beginning. Ask. It should have been simple. Somehow it was more difficult than ruling half the continent. The following morning, Alexander canceled the standing order that required Grace to report to his chambers. He also removed himself from the infirmary schedule entirely. Daniel raised one eyebrow when he saw the change. That is unexpectedly mature. Do not sound disappointed. I had grown attached to the medical crisis. Alexander ignored him. 2 days passed. Grace treated patients, reviewed records, and did her best not to wonder why the royal wing had become so quiet. She should have been relieved. Instead, every time footsteps approached the infirmary door, some ridiculous part of her expected Alexander to appear with another impossible complaint. He never did. On the third afternoon, Grace found Daniel waiting near the herb cabinet. "Is he sick again?" she asked before she could stop herself. Daniel smiled. "No good. He has also avoided the infirmary, canceled every unnecessary medical check, and drank the herbal tonic you left behind because he said wasting medicine would be disrespectful." Grace stared at him. "He drank that voluntarily? I believe guilt has medicinal value." She laughed despite herself. Daniel's expression softened. "For what it is worth, he feels terrible." "He should." Agreed. That answer surprised her. "You are not defending him?" "No. He was foolish." Daniel folded his hands behind his back. "But he understood why you were upset." Immediately, Grace looked down at the bundle of dried lavender she was sorting. "Understanding does not erase it." "No, and being king does not make it smaller." "Also no." Daniel nodded toward the corridor. "Which is why he told everyone not to pressure you into returning to his care." Grace's hands stilled. "He did, very clearly." Something warm and inconvenient moved through her chest. That evening, she crossed the castle courtyard carrying no medical bag. The moon garden was nearly empty, washed in pale silver light. Alexander stood beside the fountain reading a letter, completely alone. When he saw her, surprise replaced the usual certainty in his face. "Grace, Your Majesty." He folded the letter immediately. "Are you here as my healer?" No, the word changed everything. Alexander set the letter aside. Grace stopped several feet away. "I wanted to know whether you understood why I was angry. Because I made you believe your skill had failed when the problem was never real." She held his gaze. "And because—" He took a breath. "Because your care is not something I am entitled to manipulate simply because I wanted more of your time." Grace felt some of the tightness inside her loosen. "Good. I am sorry." No joke followed. No excuse. "I should have asked to see you. I should have accepted whatever answer you gave." Grace nodded slowly. "Yes." Alexander looked almost relieved by the bluntness. "I have canceled every order connected to your attendance." Daniel told me. "Of course he did." A faint smile appeared, then faded. "You do not owe me another conversation after this." Grace studied him beneath the moonlight. "That is the problem." "What is?" "I actually wanted one." Alexander went still. Grace stepped closer, not enough to erase the distance, only enough to make her meaning clear. "I like the tea. I like the arguments. I even liked watching you pretend that herbal tonic was not terrible." His eyes warmed. "It was terrible. I know. So what happens now?" Grace looked at him for a long moment. "Now you stop being my patient." Alexander nodded. "And then, if you still want my company, you ask me like a man who is not dying." For the first time in days, his smile returned fully. "Grace Bennet, would you walk with me tomorrow evening?" She let him wait exactly 3 seconds. "Yes." The next evening, Grace arrived at the moon garden without a medical bag, without a symptom chart, and without any intention of checking Alexander's pulse unless he gave her a very good reason. He was waiting beside the same fountain where they had spoken the night before, dressed simply for once. No council robes, no formal guards at his shoulder. When he saw her, the tension in his face eased. "You came." Grace raised one eyebrow. "You asked." "I am beginning to appreciate that method. It is surprisingly effective." They started along the stone path beneath the silver-leafed trees. For several minutes, neither mentioned illnesses, medicine, or the embarrassing series of decisions that had brought them there. Instead, Alexander asked about the infirmary. Grace asked about his counsel. He complained about 3 hours spent debating grain storage. She told him one of her youngest patients had hidden 2 cookies inside a bandage drawer. Which crisis was worse? Alexander asked. "The cookies. I suspected as much." Grace laughed, and the sound seemed to make him relax even more. They reached a quiet overlook where the castle lights glowed behind them and the forest stretched into the distance. Alexander leaned against the stone railing. "I have been thinking about something you said. That is dangerous. You told me if I wanted something, I should ask." Grace looked at him. "A revolutionary idea." Apparently. He hesitated. That alone made her smile. The Alpha King could negotiate treaties, command rooms, and challenge entire councils, but one personal question had reduced him to careful silence. "Grace, Yes. May I kiss you? There it was. No invented symptom. No convenient excuse. No royal command. Just a question. Grace let the silence stretch for one heartbeat, then two. Alexander's expression remained steady, but she caught the faint uncertainty beneath it. You could have saved yourself 3 days of fake headaches by asking that sooner, she said. I am aware. And several cups of terrible tonic. A painful lesson. And one very tired healer. His expression softened. That part one regret most. Grace believed him. That mattered more than any perfect apology. She stepped closer. Then yes. Alexander did not move immediately. Yes. You asked a clear question. I am giving you a clear answer. A quiet smile appeared on his face. I should have tried this system earlier. Much earlier. He leaned closer only after she stayed where she was. The kiss was brief and gentle, more tender than dramatic. And when they stepped apart, Grace felt the ridiculous urge to laugh. Alexander looked concerned. Was that medically disappointing? No, concerning. Also no. Then why are you smiling? Grace folded her arms. Because the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories invented an entire illness for something that required 6 words. Alexander considered that. In my defense, asking was significantly more intimidating than pretending to be sick in front of a professional healer. At the time, yes. Grace shook her head. You are impossible. Healthy, though. Annoyingly. They resumed walking, slower now. When they reached the fountain, Daniel was waiting at a respectful distance with a folder beneath one arm. His eyes moved from Alexander to Grace, then immediately to the suspiciously pleased expression on the king's face. Should I reschedule tomorrow's medical emergency? Alexander gave him a look. Grace answered first. Cancel it permanently. Daniel nodded solemnly. A historic recovery. Alexander sighed. Why do I employ you? For efficiency. Grace laughed. Daniel handed Alexander the folder and left before the king could respond. Alexander looked at Grace. I suppose this means I am no longer your patient. Correct. And if I wanted to see you again? Grace pretended to think. You could try asking. He smiled. Dinner tomorrow? Yes. No symptoms required? Absolutely none. Alexander offered his hand. Grace took it. As they walked back toward the castle, she realized the strange little deception that had irritated her so thoroughly had also revealed something neither of them expected. He had wanted her attention. She had wanted his honesty. In the end, both had discovered that affection worked better when nobody had to pretend. Grace glanced at him. One more rule. I am listening. Next time, just ask. Alexander nodded with complete seriousness. Agreed. Then his mouth curved. Although that would have saved the kingdom a remarkable amount of herbal tea.